Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
Very glad to have you with us on this special Labor Day edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Today, Jim and I are joined in one of those rare occasions where we actually have a guest. And this guest is an avid listener to the Three Martini Lunch as well, and always highlights our diehard references. So he's very special to us, and that's Tevi Troy of the Bipartisan Policy Forum, and he's the author of The Power and the Money, The Epic Clashes Between Commanders-in-Chief and Titans of Industry. So it's a good tie into Labor Day. Tevi, it's great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me. Yippee-ki-yay.
Absolutely right. So one of the things that Jim and I appreciate about you, among the diehard references as well, but the historical perspective that you provide to different items that pop up in the news, and we were just talking about it before we started. So when people say, oh, this has never happened before, or this is unprecedented, or things like that, how fast do your spidey senses go off, given that we've got a 230-some year history of the presidency?
I would say immediately. I hate when people say unprecedented with respect to the president, because it's almost never accurate. And in fact, in 2020, I kept hearing all this stuff about it's unprecedented, all the fighting in the Trump White House. And I wrote my book, Fight House, which you guys were very kind to. And in that book, I talked about how there had been a lot of fighting in the White House in previous administrations, and fighting is kind of endemic to the White House. So whenever I hear the word unprecedented, I go look for precedents.
Kind of just a natural follow-up to that. I guess you could characterize this as presentism, this idea of people who are looking at this moment in history and either forget about or maybe never learned about any of that. Do you feel like that leads to bad thinking, bad analysis, and bad decisions? Like in other words, that old saying, those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. What is the value when you come along and say, when somebody says, this has never happened before, and you pop up or crash through the wall like the Kool-Aid man and say, well, actually, it has happened before, and here are all these times?
Yeah, I guess people do find me kind of annoying when I do that, it's my shtick, so. No. But look, I think people lose perspective all the time. I mean, you hear every day, this is the worst it's ever been. Things are horrible. Things really aren't that horrible. I mean, I have an iPhone. I didn't have an iPhone in the 1990s. I mean, there are all kinds of things that we have today that we didn't have 30 years ago. And, Jim and I were both around in the 1990s, and people were talking about how terrible it was and how, Gingrich is taking over and Clinton is being impeached and all these horrible things are happening in the 90s. Now I look back and say the 90s look pretty darn good, right? I mean, there was peace and there was prosperity. I don't like everything Clinton did, but I think people lose perspective on what's going on. And I think people tend to look at whatever moment they're in as the worst of all possible moments. Now, I'm not like Pangloss. I don't think every moment is the best of all possible moments. But I try in the guise of my mentor, the late Ben Wattenberg, I try and see the good in things that are happening as opposed to just the negativity.
Do you think it's a combination of these factors, or one more than the other? That A, people just get so worked up into their politics that they convince themselves, and maybe they're in an echo chamber, depending on who they follow on social media as well, or they just don't know history, so it seems like it's the worst that they can think of?
Yeah, I think it's both of those, but then there's another, and it's related to your A, which is, people are so caught up in the politics, is I think there's a decline in religion. And it used to be that religion is what would occupy people, and they thought very deeply about it, and they had spiritual lives. And now, with the decline of religion, the most popular religion in America is none. And I don't mean Catholic nuns. I mean people have no religion. And so they make politics their religion. And as you know, religious differences have led to wars and killings and all kinds of terrible things over the years. So people, if you make your politics your religion, then you kind of can have that, I won't say violent approach, but that hysterical approach to doctrinal differences that has caused trouble in the past.
Z-Biotics, because if you are going to be doing any drinking, you need to make sure that you wake up feeling as fresh as possible the next morning. That's where Z-Biotics comes in. All you have to do is take Z-Biotics before you have your first drink of the night, and then the next morning you'll definitely feel better than you would if you hadn't taken Z-Biotics the night before.
Z-Biotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in your gut. And it's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next morning. Z-Biotics produces an enzyme that breaks down this byproduct. So just remember to make Z-Biotics your first drink of the night. As always, drink responsibly, and you will feel your best the next morning.
Yeah, like I've said many times, I've got a coworker who knew exactly how much he could drink, but as he got older, he started to feel worse in the mornings. So when we got the chance to pitch for ZBiotics here, he tried it, his wife tried it, and it made a huge, huge difference. So go to zbiotics.com/3ml to get 15% off your first order when you use 3ml at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with 100% money-back guarantees, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Visit zbiotics.com/3ml and use the code 3ml at checkout for 15% off. Thank you, ZBiotics, for sponsoring this episode and our good times. All right, on to our second part of our conversation with Tevi, and that is specifically looking at his book, The Power and the Money. Jim, take it away.
I was reading through, first of all, some great reviews. The Economist, Wall Street Journal, lots of places like that. So congratulations on all of those. One of the leads, or the core of the Economist review, looked at Elon Musk. And I think there are a lot of people who look at Musk and say, oh my goodness, he's the richest man in the world. And he controls, I still call it Twitter, X, SpaceX, saving our astronauts stuck up on the space station in a couple of months. Teslas, which used to be very rare on our roads. Now it feels like certainly here in Northern Virginia, it feels like every other car on the road is a Tesla. And I've even seen a few Cybertrucks. So who are the historical figures who you look at and say, people say, oh my goodness, we've never seen anything like this. Who do you look to in the past who actually this figure is kind of comparable to Musk, and his interaction with the administration is comparable to that. And how do you draw those parallels?
Oh, absolutely. I think there are multiple people who have analogies to Musk in the book. One is Henry Ford. I mean, he reshapes the car industry. The Model T was everywhere, just like the Tesla is everywhere. And it was an affordable car, just like the Tesla is now an affordable electric vehicle. But he was also outspoken. Henry Ford buys the Dearborn Independent so that he would have a platform to get his views out there. He was involved with presidents. He meets Woodrow Wilson in the White House in 1915 to talk about World War I and to try and make sure the U.S. didn't get involved in World War I. Oops. But he tells Wilson Henry Ford jokes, because there was actually a Henry Ford joke book that was out there. And so you see on Twitter, X, whatever, all the time there are Elon Musk jokes that are constant. So tons of parallels with Henry Ford. But another one that I talk about in the book is Henry Luce. Henry Luce gets very involved with the Eisenhower campaign in 1952. He provides staff for the Eisenhower campaign. He provides a lot of support via Time Magazine's writings about Eisenhower. And you think about Elon Musk going all in with Trump in this election. So I see a lot of similarities there as well.
It's interesting to watch the evolution of this from the beginning of the book, where you talk about Grant, and for the most part, he just kind of let the bankers and the industrial executives kind of do their thing. Regulation came in a little bit later, but you had J.P. Morgan basically saving the country after the panic of 1893. They loved McKinley, and then in come the progressives. Teddy Roosevelt, Taft to some extent, and obviously Woodrow Wilson. So there's different stages of where the government starts to really get into the business of business and drill down and regulate and micromanage and that sort of thing. How much of that blame belongs to the progressives? There's also the FDR era, and then, other progressives down the line. So who gets the most blame for going beyond making sure that there's not abuse of monopolistic or other dominant organizations, as opposed to the government trying to determine everything that businesses can do?
Well, our friend Jonah Goldberg would certainly want me to say Woodrow Wilson here, and he has a lot. There's a lot to blame Wilson for. But Teddy Roosevelt really takes up this idea of you can target an individual, like he targeted John D. Rockefeller, and he can use the regulatory state against him. Roosevelt would have late night meetings in the White House where they were specifically talking about how to go after these industrial executives in a way that the president doesn't get involved today. I mean, when in the 1990s, when the Clinton administration was going after Bill Gates and Microsoft, those discussions were happening at Justice Department in the Antitrust Division. Clinton wasn't personally involved in the details the way Roosevelt was a century earlier.
And then the other question is, as you mentioned right at the beginning, is that presidents are there for a term or two, and then you have executives like Henry Ford, who's there for decades and decades and decades. And so there's two different strategies. There's the J.P. Morgan or Henry Ford approach, where you try to stay on good terms with who's in power no matter what. And then there's the John Rockefeller approach of, I hate you no matter what party you're from, just kind of leave me alone. But in terms of navigating from a progressive like Wilson to much more hands-off people like Harding and Coolidge especially. And then when FDR comes in, you're back to riding that storm. And we see it now. I mean, trying to be on as good of terms as possible with Obama, switch to Trump, back to Biden, just to protect your business as much as you can. So what's that whiplash like, whether it's 100 years ago or right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think Jim will appreciate this analogy because I think it's really like you're managing a stereo, with the different dials, with the squelch and the tone and everything. And so you want to up your involvement, meaning you want to be involved in politics so things don't happen without you and you can have a say on policy, but you want to decrease your partisanship. So you can't pick too hard one side or the other. So you want to be there, you want to have relations with both sides, you want to be part of the conversation, you want to have them listening to you, but you don't want to go say, I'm going to give $1 billion to this particular candidate, because that will put you in bad stead when the other candidate wins.
Depending on the administration, it's basically you're trying to minimize the damage versus another administration, you're kind of pushing for as much as you can get it, at least quietly in terms of the public presentation?
Yeah, look, the regulatory state is so powerful today, and there are so many things they can do, and they can really tell you who you hire and what kind of environmental policies you can have and where you can sell your product. And so these businesses have to be careful not to alienate the regulatory state. There's also this issue of what I call selective enforcement, where there's no way regulators can enforce every single regulation. There's so many, they don't even know all of them. But they can say, oh, we don't like you, this particular executive, and we're going to use every regulation we can find to go after you. And that's something that I think Elon Musk could potentially face in a Harris administration if she were to win.
And the other thing that struck me in the book, it didn't shock me as much as it would shock me now, but when FDR comes into office, most corporate executives, including the media, Henry Luce, as well as Warner Brothers, they're all staunch Republicans. So, 80, 90 years ago, you've got people who are coming at it from more of that profitability perspective, whereas now you come at it from the media or Hollywood. I mean, they couldn't be more left. So how did that shift change?
So
it seems like the Warner Brothers actually shifted.
Yeah, so the number one is that you look at certain industries, and they're particularly important industries like the high-tech industry or Hollywood or the media. A lot of the employees are very left-wing. And so you're not necessarily looking at shareholder value and making your decisions, but you're looking at keeping your employees on board with you. And then that militates going towards the Democrats. Another thing is that a lot of Republicans feel like, well, we've carried your water corporations for all these years and we get criticized all the time for it. And then you do things like back the Affordable Care Act in 2009, 2010, or you side with Obama. So we're not going to carry water for you anymore. So that's the second factor. And then the third factor is the companies look at this and they say, well, we look at three things. Are you going to bash us in your rhetoric? Are you going to go after us with your policies? And do we have some kind of cultural alignment with you individually? And so as Republicans are more likely to bash corporations and more likely to push forward anti-corporate policies, then the executives look at the cultural thing, and maybe they want to align with people whose kids go to the same school that their kids go to. And so the cultural factor becomes more important when the other two advantages that used to exist with dealing with Republicans are no longer there.
How often have we seen the shifting of the roles towards corporate America over, at least since McKinley, I guess, between Republicans being skeptical, like Teddy Roosevelt, back to Coolidge, who would be more positive, but there were some things he didn't let Henry Ford get away with, as you point out in the book. And then, of course, more recently, corporate America seems to be going more woke in some ways, although they're backing off of that. But the current Republican Party is certainly not as warm towards corporate America as we saw a generation ago.
Yeah, so I would say that the Democrats have always been pretty critical of corporations, even when there are some friendships and alignments. But you can pretty much count on the Democrats being with you. No matter how many woke employees you hire, you're going to have Bernie Sanders still going after the millionaires and billionaires. So that's not going to change. So they're a steady thing. The Republicans have more variation. And so you have a Teddy Roosevelt, who's very critical of corporations. And then Taft and McKinley, as you correctly note, were less so. And so the Republicans go up and down. And I think now the Republicans are in a down moment in terms of how critical they are of corporations. So right now you have that confluence of factors where both the Democrats and Republicans seem to be corporate bashers.
Other than no, that's not unprecedented, what did you want to convey in the book more than anything?
Well, I wanted to convey the way that 150 years ago in 1870, we had individual American citizens had very little interaction with big business or with big government. And now they're completely enmeshed in our lives. And you don't go a day without having a product that is created by a big corporation, or dealing with something that the government creates. The government subsidizes and regulates our schools, and they subsidize and regulate our roads. They subsidize and regulate our food. So we are much more the creature of big business and big government than we were 150 years ago. And I think we as citizens need to think about that.
I just want to point out, listeners, in addition to learning so much about Tevi's book, we'll also find out he has a very underrated Bernie Sanders impression with the billionaires and billionaires.
I learned about the impressions from you, Jim.
Is spreading throughout Washington.
Yeah, we're going to have an impression off on Bernie Sanders here. Yeah. Both of you guys do it very, very well. So in a second, we'll talk about what's really at the heart of our conversation today.
The most important issue facing America today.
Yes, that's Die Hard.
Were there 4 movies or 5?
Stay with us. All right, so Tevi, I'm sure there are many ways we could transition from The Power and the Money to Die Hard, but I guess the most important question is how would Joe Takagi try to lobby the California state government or even federal regulators, given the amount of money he was keeping on hand in his vault?
We should point out for listeners, Mr. Takagi could not be with us today.
And he won't be joining us for the rest of his life.
Yes.
So look, I in preparation for this podcast, I do prep for this kind of stuff. I thought about links between The Power and the Money and Die Hard, and I think about the way they lay out, and not they, but Hans Gruber lays out his resume in painstaking detail about how he went to Stanford and Harvard and law school and business school, and it was kind of the perfect CV for a CEO. That Joe Takagi had this perfect preparation, but in the end, he came up against a negotiator who was kind of unyielding and had the power of the gun in his hand. And so Takagi did not survive that interaction. And I would not say government is as violent necessarily, but government's regulations are there, and they are enforced effectively with the power of the gun. And so Takagi, I think, would have had to change his strategy because obviously his strategy didn't get him through the first movie and get him profitable residuals by being in future movies.
It didn't make it through the first 20 minutes. Go ahead, Jim.
I have a whole bunch of very funny questions, but I'm going to try to get somewhat serious. And, one, thank you for observing and retweeting every Die Hard reference we make on the show, which is copious and frequent. So, Tevi, my question to you is, why do you, and maybe by extension you can speak on behalf of the fan base, why do we love this movie so? Why do we, genuine, I say mostly tongue-in-cheek that it's one of the classics of Western civilization, but clearly something about it just sticks with us, and we enjoy making these references. And obviously it's a great movie, but there are a lot of great movies out there. So it's kind of what does Die Hard mean to you? And in some strange way, does this movie reflect something about our philosophy or how we see the world?
I absolutely think it does. I'm glad you asked the question. Look, I saw Die Hard when it came out in the theaters in D.C. in 1988, and I'd read this terrible review in the Washington Post saying how awful this movie was. And I went anyway because I was curious, and it had great ads, with the let's come out to the coast. Remember, he's crawling through the air vent. And I saw the movie, and it was just so joyous. I had such a good time. I was elated when I came out of the theater. And at that moment, I vowed that I would never again trust the Washington Post on movie reviews. And I still haven't. I don't trust them on other editorial issues either.
There's only 1 or 2 columnists over there you should listen to.
Jim Garrity, I was very glad to see Ramesh, you. The Washington Post, Hugh Hewitt, Ramesh. I mean, so now there are some good columnists, but Charles Krauthammer back in the day. But so the sheer joy I had in the movie, but I also like the way it remade the action movie. In terms of having, first of all, clear good guys and clear bad guys. We don't necessarily have that in Hollywood today. In fact, you see these spy thrillers today where the CIA aligns with the Chinese state security services, and it makes me infuriated because I remember in the 80s, the KGB were the bad guys, and the American people knew the KGB were the bad guys. And so here you have left-wing German terrorists are the bad guys. I'm all on board with that any day of the week. So clear message, good versus evil, bring in the humor, and it's on Christmas, so I think it's all good.
Yeah, I think that's true. And giving good lines to the bad guys, I think, was something that didn't happen a lot before Die Hard. I mean, Hans Gruber, and got to give credit to Alan Rickman for just
first movie. His
first movie he ever did. But so many great lines. I mean, I laugh at him, as I rewatch it, almost as much as I laugh at John McClane's one-liners. And it also presents a fairly cynical view of our institutions, especially law enforcement in certain cases,
the media,
as well as the media. Yeah, and I think honestly, Dick Thornburg could be arguably the worst villain in the whole movie. So in terms of those things, I think it helps to ring true a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely all true. And look, they pick the right bad guys, they pick the right good guys, and McClane is just funny. I mean, he's funny. He's always got a quip, and he's not like Schwarzenegger. Actually, I read this great book about the action heroes of the '80s and how after Bruce Willis has this big hit with Die Hard, he goes into one of the big Hollywood restaurants. I think it was Chasen's, and Schwarzenegger sees him and says, "You can't be an action star with those toothpick arms." And I think the regular guyness of Bruce Willis really made the movie appealing to the rest of us.
I concur with everything you guys just said. I just want to point out that there's something about the way Willis plays McClane as an ordinary guy stuck in extraordinary circumstances. And we see him afraid at various points early in the movie where he's yelling at himself. He's also a guy who has kind of screwed up his marriage, and that, but he wants to make it better. These are very human, relatable, everyday and ordinary characteristics and circumstances that I think makes it easier to relate even more than, as much as I like Harrison Ford, Indiana Jones, or Tom Cruise's Ethan Hunt. As far as I could tell, Ethan Hunt spends all of his free time rock climbing and just running and running and running all the time, preparing for his missions.
Or Schwarzenegger. In Commando, Schwarzenegger smells the bad guys coming. Yes. Bruce Willis would never do that.
My less serious questions, but the fact that I'm asking them, it'll tell you a lot about the fifth Die Hard movie, that you have Bruce Willis killing a bunch of Russians, and I still don't think it was that good a movie. If there's everything that's tailor-made for me, it's that. So why are there only 4 Die Hard movies is my semi-tongue-in-cheek question. And semi-seriously, are there life lessons or foreign policy lessons, like never trust the Germans, perhaps? Or if you see a city construction crew made up entirely of white guys, that indicates that affirmative action has not been a factor and you should not trust them, that they're not real New York City workers or something. What other things have you seen in the Die Hard movies that you're like, you know what, that's a political or public policy or ideology lesson?
Well, I've talked about how presidential candidates are mentioned in Die Hard movies. Die Hard 3 mentions both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Which I think is interesting. But I also think one of the things about Die Hard is the first movie is contained in a building. And then each movie, they try and expand it. So it goes from a building to an airport, to a city, to a country, to a foreign country. And by expanding it, you lose this ability of Bruce Willis to have leverage over the entire situation. One man can't do everything across the entire international landscape. He's not going to become like the car thieves who become international spies in the Fast and the Furious.
Yes.
He's supposed to be this ordinary guy in extraordinary circumstances, as you said, and keeping it contained makes for better movies. And the more they expanded it, the more they made it hard to keep the original ethic.
Yeah, and they also made the violence more cartoonish, especially in 4 and whatever it is they tried to do after that, and even a little bit in 3. But the storyline in 3 was so great.
But the water spout moment in 3 is the worst moment, when he's just driving on the highway and Bruce Willis comes up on the water spout and he sees him. So yeah, there were some problems in 3. But a lot of IQ points dedicated to 5 movies that are kind of not necessarily highbrow movies in this interaction. I love it.
Yeah, never get tired of it. My wife now insists on watching it at Christmas time, and I, of course, oblige and would have watched it anyway, but it's fantastic. The kids are asking when they can watch it. Not for a while is the is the right answer, but it's right up there, and it holds its power at 36 years later. So, Tevi, great to have you with us. Thanks so much for your faithful listening and your commentary on Twitter when we do mention the greatest action movie of all time. So, and best of luck, of course, with the book, The Power and the Money.
Great. Thanks for having me on, and I love the podcast.
Tevi Troy with the Bipartisan Policy Center. The book is The Power and the Money, the epic clashes between commanders-in-chief and titans of industry. I'm Greg Corumbus of Radio America. Jim Garrity, of course, from National Review. Join us again for our regular fare on Tuesday. In the meantime, please subscribe to the podcast if you don't already. Tell your friends about it as well. Thanks also for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch Podcast. Follow all of us on Twitter. Tevi's at Tevi Troy. Jim is at Jim Garrity. I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a great Labor Day. Join us again on Tuesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.